It's Friday, February 7th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, Elon Musk rages and raids. The new Trump administration is heading full speed, tearing through agencies, and Elon Musk is leading the pack, forcing career employees at places like the CIA and FBI to take loyalty tests or be fired, and stealing your personal information. Yes, your information, and trying to cover it up. My conversation today is with the former Deputy Administrator of the USAID, the number 2 in command of the U.S. Agency for International Development under George W. Bush, Jim Kunder. We talk all about USAID, which as of today has been effectively shut down, what that means for the U.S. and the rest of the world, and what might happen next. But first, let's get to your headlines. On Monday, the Environmental Protection Agency began cleaning up in Los Angeles after the 3 wildfires there that had burned tens of thousands of acres and cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $135 to $150 billion in damage, were fully contained. The agency, which is under threat of mass layoffs right now from the Trump administration, is the first phase of cleanup in this process. They come in and try to remove anything that might be toxic or hazardous, and that could be a lot of things because more than 12,000 homes were completely burned to the ground, and that could mean a lot of chemicals were released either into the air or absorbed back into the ground when the fires were being put out. The agency needs to clear certain areas before people are allowed to be let back in and start what will be a rebuilding process, but that might not happen until months from now. On Tuesday, search crews lifted the wreckage of the American Airlines flight that crashed into the Potomac River last week out of the water. The investigation is still happening, but the head of the National Transportation Safety Board said the airline pilots acted exactly as they were supposed to, and investigators say the pilots of the Army helicopter, which was pulled from the water yesterday, would likely have been wearing night vision goggles, but again, we still don't know why or how this really happened. The crash is the first deadly airline crash in the country since 2009, and it has sent shockwaves through the nation's safety agencies, many of which are being targeted by the Trump administration right now, like the FAA and the Department of Transportation for mass firings. But Trump did promise to update our air traffic control system, saying he wants to computerize the system that he says will be brand new, not pieced together. Now, our air traffic controllers are currently working on a computerized system, but Trump did not give an idea about what it would cost or the timeline for overhauling our flight safety control systems. On Thursday, the NCAA made the sweeping decision to ban trans girls and trans women from participating in women's sports at the college level. The move overturns 15 years of the NCAA allowing trans women to compete after a year of testosterone suppression. The decision is in line with a brand new Trump administration executive order banning trans women from competing in women's sports. And it's important to know that out of the 530,000 NCAA athletes, the NCAA head, Charlie Baker, told Congress last year that fewer than 10 of those athletes are trans. And right now, it's also not clear if both the executive order and the NCAA new policy are constitutional because they don't ban trans men from playing in men's sports, which could violate equal protection rights under U.S. law. And for our final headline today, on this day in 1956 in Crystal, Minnesota, my father was born. And he's going to hate this, but it's my show, and so I'm going to do what I want, Dad. And I know that you don't want anything for your birthday, so this is as good as it gets. All I'm going to say is, Dad, you are the best father a guy could ask for. I love you. Happy birthday, and I'll call you later. Okay, those are our headlines for today. Let's get to today's main topic. Elon Musk moves fast and breaks the government. It has been an unbelievable week in politics, and frankly, one that we had just never seen before. This week, Elon Musk, as part of his role as the head of the not real Department of Government Efficiency, has been targeting government agency after government agency with a crew of barely out of college or even high schoolers to suss out what they think is wasteful spending in theory. It's led to mass layoffs, warnings of mass layoffs, stopped payments to vital services and programs, put the private information of millions of Americans at risk, and possibly risking national secrets that could mean the difference between life or death. And I know that sounds dramatic, but like I said, what happened this week is something we have never seen before. But let's back up. Trump brought in Elon Musk to try and cut a huge chunk of government spending, somewhere on the order, Musk thinks, of $2 trillion. Now, to do that, Trump made Musk the head of something called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which shares the same name as an internet meme of a dog because Musk thinks it's funny. But it's not a real department. Essentially, it's a division of a very small U.S. Department of Digital Services, which I've talked about before. Now, Trump had to do this because he can't unilaterally create a department. Only Congress can do that. And because it's not a real department, Musk isn't actually in charge of anything, so he's classified as a special government employee. Now, that is a real thing, and it's been around since the early 1960s or so. Under U.S. law, it's meant to be a government employee working for the taxpayer for anywhere from 130 days to a full year. However, that designation does not make Elon Musk an elected official. It does not make him confirmed by any members of Congress, meaning his conflicts of interest, of which there are many, weren't vetted by the people who represent us. It also doesn't make him an officially appointed member of the executive branch under the Constitution that would give him some kind of expanded power. And on top of it, Musk might not even be a legitimate U.S. citizen. So Musk is a South African immigrant who did get his U.S. citizenship, but has admitted that when he came to the U.S. and stayed here, he did so illegally by violating the terms of his visa. Here he is admitting to that back in 2020 on a podcast with his brother.
But I was not legally in America, so I was illegally there.
I was legally there, but I was meant to be doing student work.
Oh yeah, right.
I had a student work visa.
Yeah, you were doing you were supposed to be doing a PhD in Stanford, and decided not to.
So it was like I was allowed to do work, sort of supporting whatever, you know.
And this wasn't even the first time that Musk had said this into a microphone. Which also, these guys just keep saying stuff like this into microphones, on camera, on purpose. It is just the wildest thing to keep being able to pull these things up. But regardless, the point being here is that Musk really has no business under the Constitution to be leading this crusade against the government from the inside, but nonetheless, there he is. And he's also not doing it alone. He's got a crack team of people, most of them under the age of 26. Most of them fresh out of college, one of them a college freshman, and one of them was a dropout. Now, they all have some sort of tech-ish background, a lot of low-level jobs or just internships, some of them working for one of Musk's companies directly or in areas that he's interested in, but none of them have any government experience or knowledge of what these agencies or their employees actually do, despite on their resumes now they're calling themselves experts. And that fact makes it all the more disturbing to learn that these guys are getting access to some of the most sensitive data in a lot of government agencies, beginning with the Office of Personnel Management, which is essentially the federal government's HR department, where they accessed the personal info of millions of Americans who work in the government. And that's a lot of sensitive data, like their social security numbers, finances, salaries, home addresses, demographics, and disciplinary histories. From there, these guys moved on to USAID, or the U.S. Agency of International Development. And I know that I talked a little bit about this last week too, and we'll talk about it more today with my guest, Jim Kunder, a little later on. But because of this work being done by a bunch of barely not college kids USAID had to announce a full stop work order that meant the firing of 10,000 employees, many of whom are being flown home today from overseas posts, and the stoppage of hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, medicine, and program funding across the world, or as this real headline from the New York Times put it, thousands of people have been abandoned in the middle of clinical trials of medication and medical devices, some of them already in their bodies, without any way to monitor them or receive care because there is no one there to do the work. Now, there has been some defending of shutting down USAID. There's been a right-wing firestorm, really, led by the White House and the White House press secretary to say that USAID was propping up media outlets like the New York Times or Politico, a politics-focused outlet that I talk about a bunch and I read a bunch and you've heard me talk about on this show, or even the BBC over in the UK to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. But, surprise, surprise, that's not what's happening. Almost all of that money that's being cited is either being exaggerated because people have trouble understanding basic government spreadsheets, or it was for mostly things like subscriptions to these outlets for, say, an entire branch of the military or USAID, or for services that are really niche like Politico Pro, which is something Politico does. That's a policy tracking service that is used by basically every office in Congress and their members of staff, and people like employees of USAID who serve overseas who want to keep up with policy things. And it's an expensive subscription. And it's also one that all these people rely on every single day. But none of that matters now because Donald Trump put out a memo on Thursday ordering agencies to stop all media subscriptions, meaning it will deprive agencies of access to basic information while Elon Musk and his gang are shutting down government websites. Now, there are worries that USAID is being targeted by Elon Musk because he has a lot of business dealings with China, like billions of dollars in contracts with the Chinese government that would love nothing better than for us to end one of our most successful agencies for strategic goodwill around the world so that China can then come back in behind us and pick up the pieces. But we'll talk about that with Jim coming up in a little bit. Now, after USAID, Musk and company moved on to the National Institutes for Health, the CDC, the Department of Labor, NOAA, which is our weather program and administration used for everything from like hurricane detection to forecasts for farmers, and the Department of Energy, where apparently at least one of these staffers was able to gain access to programs that make sure that we have internet access to our programs that control our nuclear weapons, and they went over the advice of not doing that from the department's lawyer. But, I'm sure it's fine. And when it comes to all of this, we have reporting that says these 20-something staffers are just barging their way into departments, not identifying themselves beyond their first names, and demanding access to really, really sensitive information, which is what happened at the U.S. Department of Treasury this week. And this was the one that caused the most panic in a week filled with a lot of panic throughout the government. Musk turned his attention to the Treasury because of the government's payment systems. Now, we are talking about payments for things like Social Security, tax returns, tax data, government salaries, funding for government programs like Head Start, where leaders across the country of that program, which helps kids get into early schooling so they can start their educations. Well, leaders across the country in those programs couldn't get access to their own data this week, or shutting down websites for things like rural.gov, which gives rural Americans resources to things like job search help. But that website went offline this week after DOGE workers raided the Treasury Department. This is access to billions and billions of dollars that we are talking about here, going to millions of people who really need it. And now, at the Treasury, officials said the 25-year-old government employee who showed up with ties to Musk's unofficial department was only given read-only access only for sources inside to tell Wired magazine that, in fact, they were given administrator access, with one source saying you could do anything with these privileges, and then added that they couldn't think of a reason why you would need this kind of access to just look for fraud. Now, finally, it was Medicaid and Medicare, where they were able to get access to the personal medical files of millions of Americans. Now, the Government Accountability Office found last year that there was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion in payment errors from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And that's not all fraud. In fact, it's actually unclear just how much of it is actually fraud. The term is payment errors, so that includes things like, fraud, but also underpayments, overpayments, payments going to the wrong person by mistake, or payments going out despite things like mismanaged care at a facility. But that is the kind of thing that this department is supposed to be looking for, except it's not really the data they're collecting. And on top of all of that, no one seems sure if these employees under Elon Musk are using secure servers or secure hard drives when they download this data. In a recent court filing, which I'll get to the courts a little later here, the Office of Personnel Management said that DOGE employees were using secure government computers, but then there wasn't any real indication of if they were being held to only using government computers. It certainly didn't seem that way when we learned from the Washington Post that in order to sort all this data, they've collected for waste or fraud or things that don't align with Trump's agenda. They're running all that through the Microsoft cloud, which again has no indication of how secure any of this is. And it's also worth mentioning here that we're learning that Musk and his employees have been trying to figure out how to move their inter-office conversations and some of the work that they've been doing off of government systems to avoid being subject to things like freedom of information requests, where we get to see what they're talking about over government servers. They've also begun asking places like the CIA and the FBI to give lists of names of agents, some in very high-risk assignments, and then having agents take loyalty screening tests, but not to the U.S. necessarily, but to Trump's agenda. And again, it's unclear how secure any of this stuff is. And that really is the point of why you're seeing or hearing stories about all of this right now and why I'm telling you about it right now. It's not the looking for fraud or waste. I think everybody wants the government to work for us, to do it effectively and efficiently, and to make sure that the people who need help get it. The issue is the data breach. We don't know how secure it is in the hands of these inexperienced employees. We don't know where it's going or who's using it when they get their hands on it. And the irony here is that this is the kind of bureaucratic unaccountability that led Musk to push for this entire thing in the first place, and it's the thing that Republicans said that they wanted him to root out. Now, it's also worth mentioning here that Musk isn't going after any parts of the departments where he does big business, nor is he looking at payments for things like business loans that were given out during COVID. The PPP loans is what they were called, where we know millions of dollars in fraudulent money was passed out by the then Trump administration to millionaire business owners. So at this point, you're probably asking, has there been any real pushback? From Democrats, certainly. From department folks, certainly. Not really from Republicans. Some Republican senators and members of Congress have said they're worried about this agency or that agency, but really, they're pleased with most of this. Vice President J.D. Vance, chief among them, who really, I think, distilled sort of the feeling around this. He took to Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter, to say that this level of authority from Musk is what people voted for when they voted for Trump. And that may well be true in a sense. But again, Elon Musk isn't an elected official and isn't really appointed to lead an agency. And it doesn't go around the Constitution, which again says the president doesn't have, nor do his employees in the executive branch have the ability to spend money or not spend money that's been designated by Congress unless they're explicitly told to do so by law. It was so important to make sure that Congress had what's known as the power of the purse that our founders put it as the very first part of the Constitution. But when asked about Musk and Trump running right over Congress's mandated job, this is what Speaker Mike Johnson said.
It looks radical. It's not. I call it stewardship. I think they're doing right by the American taxpayer, and we support that principle. When it comes to the point of codification and legislation and all the rest, we'll be evaluating all those things. But right now, I think they're acting within the scope of their authority. There's be legal challenges. The courts will have some things to say about this. But so far as I'm concerned, Chad, this is not a usurpation of authority in any way. It's not a power grab. I think they're doing what we've all expected and hoped and asked that they would do for years.
So Johnson is and isn't telling the truth here. Again, that discretion is usually based on expertise in a narrow band of things these agencies do. And usually when these agencies are wound down or their programs are stopped, there are lots of hearings and technical meetings with these staffers because these employees know intimately what's happening, and usually the people coming in to do these audits, because there's been a change in government, don't. So, if Congress isn't going to step in, what happens now? Well, a lot of this is going to be tied up in lawsuits, labor groups, veterans groups, federal employee groups, retiree groups, FBI agents, nonprofit groups, and 13 states are all suing in various lawsuits over what Musk and his team have done, and these groups want answers for it. In at least 2 cases, federal judges have paused the actions of Musk and his department, and the Department of Treasury walked back some of the access after one of those suits was filed. But these things will take time to get through the courts, and by then, the damage, which we don't know how much will have been done by then, will have already been done. And even if it gets to the Supreme Court, which some of these things actually might, there's no guarantee that the justices would side with the American people over Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and even if they do, it's not clear that Trump would follow their order. The Constitution says the president is bound to the orders of the Supreme Court, but if you listen to J.D. Vance from just a few years ago, it doesn't matter.
I think that what Trump should do, like if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
So just to be clear, that is the now current vice president saying the Supreme Court shouldn't be listened to by the president and instead wants Trump to tell the Supreme Court, if you want me to do something, you and what army? And in the meantime, a lot of lives all over this country and all over the world are going to be irreversibly changed, and a lot of them in an instant. Okay, take a breath, hit pause on this, maybe go outside, see the sunshine, touch some grass, scream into a pillow, I don't know, that helps me. But then come back and hit play again because I've got a great conversation today. My guest is Jim Kunder. Jim was the Deputy Director for USAID under George W. Bush and joins me to talk about why losing the agency isn't just bad for the U.S. and our place in it, but also the rest of the world. As we're talking today, about 10,000 or so USAID employees are being given banker's boxes and being told to clean out their desks. There was a full stop work order that was issued, and as of today, they are apparently no longer USAID workers. And before we talk about your history and the history of USAID a little bit here, for you, for somebody who led these men and women and served in USAID, what has this week been like to watch this happen to this agency?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to answer it at 2 levels. So on a personal level, it's painful for me to see dedicated, patriotic Americans who work for USAID and who were willing to take these assignments where you're sent for 3 years to, a desperately poor African country or Asian country. It's painful for me to see them being treated disrespectfully like this. At the main entrance of the USAID office in the Ronald Reagan building in Washington, the first thing you encounter is a big plaque of the dozens of USAID officers who have died in the line of duty over the years in various places around the world, looking out for the American people. And so it's very painful on a personal level to see human beings, dedicated, patriotic Americans, treated like this. But I have to say, as somebody who's been around Washington and worked for the U.S. government, it's even more painful to me to see us as a country under this administration shooting ourselves in the foot. What this organization, the U.S. Agency for International Development, does basically is part of the triad of American foreign policy. I mean, obviously we have our brave troops in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and sometimes we need to use military force around the world, hopefully as little as possible. But then we have our brave State Department diplomats who also serve around the world. And sometimes we need good diplomatic negotiations to look out for U.S. interests and to make sure that U.S. business is treated fairly and so forth. And then the third leg of the stool, or the third part of the triad, is our soft power, our foreign aid program, which is used to show people around the world that we as Americans care about them and want them to be better off in life. And so why we are shooting ourselves in the foot right now, why we are destroying one of the main tools of U.S. foreign policy, while, I might add, our Chinese adversaries are building up their own version of USAID. That's extremely painful for me as an American, because I think our children and grandchildren, if this stands, if the Congress lets this change stand, will be weaker.
Yeah, and I think we should split up some of these interests too, in interests of things like health, and then also some things that are about that idea of sort of staving off our adversaries. And because I do want to talk about the Chinese push here as well. But when we talk about some of the work that you're doing on the ground in those conflict zones, in those war zones, I mean, that has to be just indispensable work that you're doing, not just for those people, but also for our interests. How do those things even come about?
Yeah, let me tell you, if I can, I want to tell you one quick anecdote. There's a story that every person who's worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development knows about. There was a time when there was a communist government in the very large and important African country of Ethiopia, and they were against the United States the government was against the United States on every topic and supporting the Russians on every topic. And there were a group of USAID officers walking through the capital of Ethiopia, and some Ethiopians, I hope I don't offend your viewers and listeners, but a group of Ethiopians spit on them. And they were shocked, naturally, and they asked the Ethiopians, well, why did you do that? And as soon as they started speaking English, the Ethiopians who had just spit on them apologized profusely and took out their handkerchiefs and started wiping them and said, oh, we thought you were Russians. And while the government was opposing the U.S. government on every topic around the world, the people understood that through the generosity of the American people, food aid was reaching Ethiopia and medical aid was reaching Ethiopia. And so people in the developing world may be poor, but they're not stupid. And they understand that when the American people are helping them, word gets around very, very quickly. And so that always struck me as an example of what we're talking about here. The governments may complain about the United States, but the people out there in the developing world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, they understand and they very much appreciate this work that's being done. So how this works, most people, most of our fellow Americans, when they think about foreign aid, they think of it in terms of disasters. And so let's say a typhoon hits the Philippines. The way this works, of course, there is a U.S. embassy in the Philippines, but the U.S. Agency for International Development would send a team of experts that would fly in, and these would be experts in healthcare, experts in shelter, experts in the delivery of food aid, and they would bring with them very basic humanitarian supplies like planefuls of plastic sheeting, because if your home's been destroyed in a typhoon, the first thing, all you need is a couple poles and some plastic sheeting. At least you can get your family out of the rain and get them a little bit of shelter. And we would bring water purification units so that people can drink safely, process and drink water so that they're not going to get all of the dozens of diseases that occur in the aftermath of flooding. And so we respond immediately when there's a disaster around the world. And that's the kind of thing that I believe that people in the developing world remember and they very much appreciate. There's a second part of how the U.S. Agency for International Development works. So the first part is disaster relief when there's a war or a drought or a storm. The second part is what they call long-term development. And that is what they're saying is, let's take a country, let's say in Africa, let's take Chad in West Africa. It's under assault right now from fanatical terrorist organizations. And the country is a poor country. It doesn't have a lot of resources to battle the terrorists, and the terrorists can recruit people because of ancient ethnic hatreds in the country, because of poverty. And the kinds of programs USAID would run, for example, there in Mali or Chad, a couple countries in West Africa, are programs to help teenagers who can no longer afford to go to school. And the reason they can't go to school is because, unlike our public school system, there you have to buy a uniform and you have to buy your own books because the government doesn't have enough money to supply the books. And there are people who are so desperately poor, they can't afford a couple books. And so now what do you have? You have out-of-school teenagers who know they are not going to be able to get an education. They're feeling hopeless. They know they're not going to be able to get a job. And what are they? They are prime recruits for terrorist and extremist organizations. So what is USAID doing in that country? They're investing in getting these teenagers back in school so that they have a half a chance in life, maybe to get a decent job. But from a U.S. strategic investment, we're undercutting recruitment by terrorist organizations. So those are the two kinds of things that I was fortunate to be able to work on.
Right.
Both the emergency response and the long-term systems change in these countries.
And that is the thing that I mean when I say the magic of soft power, is that you've got this thing that is giving these kids, like you said, a halfway decent chance at having a job and a productive life in their country, and then also serving our interests here to keep Americans safe. It is nothing short of miraculous work, to be honest. And in that same idea, shuttering these programs across the world. I mean, one of the things that was a headline yesterday that listeners will have just heard is USAID workers had to just leave things like clinical trials for drugs and for medical devices, some of which were already in the bodies of people. And this is happening across the board in those things, in the things like we just talked about, undercutting terror recruitment. So what are we losing here by not having these people working? And then we can move on to the idea of what happens when we have to ramp these things back up. But let's talk first about what we're losing and what we're risking by walking away.
The majority of USAID officers are assigned overseas. The U.S. Agency for International Development employees are assigned overseas. And they take assignments like our military personnel. They are assigned to an African country or a Latin American country or maybe Central Asia for 2 or 3 years at a time. They go, they learn the customs, they learn the language, they understand how to work with the local people, and then they help deliver the kinds of assistance we're talking about, educational or healthcare or democracy training programs. And what happened, so let me be honest. I mean, I've worked for a long time with USAID. Almost all of these employees, they understand, they're all patriotic Americans. They understand that we have elections, new presidents get elected. Whoever comes in is going to have different ideas about how to run foreign aid. They salute, they understand, they change the direction. And so it is completely understandable that a new Trump administration comes into Washington. Things are going to change. Policies are going to change. Leaders of the agency are going to change. This is not a mystery to long-term federal employees. They understand how the system works, and they salute how the system works.
But usually it's not just a total cutting off of these things, right? There's a drawdown.
You are exactly right. So what happens normally is a new leadership cadre comes in at the top of the agency. They sit down with these long-term technical experts, agriculture experts, family planning experts, healthcare. Say, okay, look, guys, how have you been doing it? Here's how we want you to do it. We want you to shift this now. But what's happened now, for some reasons that are inconceivable to me as an American, the incoming administration is conducting some kind of vendetta where instead of having this kind of normal change in policy, they've ordered all these aid workers who are working overseas, looking out for the United States and representing the United States, to just all come home. And this means that food produced by American farmers that was shipped overseas is sitting on docks. It's going to rot on the docks. And healthcare programs where people were in the middle of receiving vaccinations against polio, all of a sudden the programs are just going to stop and children are going to die of polio. And now, as I said earlier, on a personal level, these brave Americans, patriotic Americans, their lives are being completely disrupted. They've sold their house or rented their house. Their children are in school somewhere. And it is just, in my view, inconceivably disrespectful. But this vicious attack on an institution that is part of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus around the world, this vendetta and destructiveness and shooting ourselves in the foot, as a number of observers have noted here, they are celebrating this in Moscow, they are celebrating this in Beijing, they are celebrating this in Iran, and celebrating it in North Korea. Because we are just cutting off our nose to spite our face and disrupting one of the primary tools of U.S. influence around the world.
My last question here, Jim, is what do we do now? It's clear that there's no plan right now for the Trump administration, whether it's from the president himself or from Elon Musk, who, without suggesting something, has quite a few ties to China. And there are real concerns that he might be doing some of this out of an idea of doing his own version of foreign policy and USAID for Elon Musk. But what do we do now in terms of repairing these things, and can they be repaired?
Oh, look, this is, to me, there's always a lot of this, both the Democrats and the Republicans always like to say, well, we're doing this because we're supporting the U.S. Constitution. Well, the U.S. Constitution is very clear in Article 1 that the Congress of the United States determines how to spend the taxpayers' money. Not Elon Musk, not even President Trump. It's the Congress that decides this. So if in normal times, and look, I'm not here to make a political analysis. I'm here to talk about how foreign aid works. But in normal times, the Congress of the United States would be stepping in and saying, as some senators and congressmen are saying, the President of the United States is not a king. He does not get to just unilaterally destroy a federal agency. The Congress created the U.S. Agency for International Development. The Congress decides how much money we spend on foreign aid every year. But it's pretty clear that the Trump administration is threatening the Republican senators and congressmen to prevent them from raising their hands and doing their constitutional duty to review what's happening in the destruction of U.S. power abroad. So my answer to average Americans, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, or whatever, is to call their congressional offices, their senator's office, their congressman's office, write a letter, send an email, call. Calling is always the most important thing. I had the good fortune of working on Capitol Hill for a while for a Republican member of Congress, and so I know how this works. People listen. All I would say is if some of your viewers and listeners think that this is an important issue, call the congressman. Just ask the congressmen to do their jobs, to just slow this train down a little bit. Elon Musk doesn't get to make this call on a week's notice. This is if we're maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to shut down the U.S. foreign aid program overseas. But let's have some congressional hearings. Let's think this through. And then if after 90 days of congressional hearings, everybody agrees that we need to bring home all of our foreign aid workers and let the Chinese have a clear running field, then let's do it. I don't think that makes any sense. But if the Congress of the United States agrees with the president, then let's do it in an orderly, systematic, thoughtful fashion. But this bum's rush of Elon Musk and a bunch of 20-year-olds showing up at USAID and ordering around patriotic Americans who have devoted their life to our nation's security is not the way to do business.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Sure, and thank you for doing this. And I hope some of your listeners and viewers will take some time to think about this one.
You heard them, folks. Drop a dime. All right. Thanks, Jim.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long, Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. Elon Musk and a team of barely college-aged employees have begun raiding the data and information of millions of Americans across a number of U.S. agencies looking for what they say is government waste or fraud, and have been able to tell Donald Trump to shut down agencies like USAID or to start shutting down agencies like the Department of Education. Among the agencies they got access to were the ones that pay for vital programs here and around the world, including Social Security and Medicaid, and it's unclear what they're planning to do with that data or how safe it is in their hands. Now, normally, Congress would step in because a president and his people don't have the ability to pause payments or close agencies without Congress's approval, but Speaker of the House Mike Johnson says he doesn't see anything wrong with what's happening. Now, lawsuits have been filed to stop some of these things, but they are going to be tied up in courts, and by the time the cases are over, who knows what will have happened. And before I end today, I want to say that I know it seems like in episodes like this one that I'm really going after Donald Trump and his agenda or Elon Musk, and I am to a certain degree, but not out of bias. What this is these things are so far outside of the norm, outside of how things are supposed to work, and potentially outside the law in a lot of these cases, that they deserve to be treated the way that I'm talking about them here. And I'm also sorry that this wasn't a more upbeat episode, and I think I should probably stop apologizing for that, because given the pace of the past few weeks and what we've seen, there are probably going to be a lot of episodes like this in our future. But that is it for today. I want to thank Jim again for coming on the show, and Substack subscribers, you can listen to the extended version of our conversation with Jim tomorrow, where we talk about more things like China swooping in behind the U.S. to undo decades of work and Jim's take on the Trump transition. So if you want to hear all of that, subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. A link on how to do that is in the show notes, but those conversations are for paid subscribers only. And if you don't want to do that, then please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you listen to the show on. Like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications if you're watching on YouTube. And as always, share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.